This is HOA catastrophe. I did not raise my voice, I raised my evidence packet. I am standing in my driveway at 7:15 in the morning, still in my postal carrier uniform under my navy winter jacket, and Heather Sanchez is already screaming at me about a tarp on my roof. "You need to remove that eyesore immediately," she says, jabbing a gloved finger toward my house. "This is a covenant violation, and you will pay the fee. Then you will pay the fee about the fee." I look up at the blue tarp I secured over a section of shingles 2 days ago after an ice dam ripped them loose during the last storm. The tarp. The thing keeping snow out of my attic. I ask her what fee she is talking about because I checked the HOA rules last night and there is nothing about emergency roof repairs. She pulls out her phone, already mounted on a gimbal so she can film constantly, and aims it at my face. "You do not get an opinion, you get a fine schedule," she says. The Lakeshore Freeze Point HOA board has zero tolerance for unapproved exterior modifications during winter months. That includes tarps, and I am issuing you a violation notice right now. I moved to Anchorage 3 years ago for a postal route that pays well enough to afford a house in a neighborhood where people actually shovel their walks. I thought an HOA would mean neat streets and plowed parking. What I got was Heather Sanchez, the architectural committee chair, who treats winter like her personal enforcement season. The rules here are not suggestions. They are a religion. And Heather is the high priestess. She taps her phone screen and announces that I have 72 hours to remove the tarp, or the fine escalates to $200, plus a $50 administrative fee, plus whatever her committee decides counts as a daily penalty. I ask her how I am supposed to fix shingles in the middle of January, when every roofer in town is booked for months. "Not my problem," she says. "That is what contingency funds are for. You should have planned better." I take a breath and pull my small notepad out of my jacket pocket. The pages are damp from melting snow, but I write down the time, the date, and exactly what she just said. Heather notices and her expression shifts. She steps closer, holding her phone higher. "What are you doing?" she asks. "Taking notes," I say. "Same as you." She smirks and turns to leave, but then she stops and looks back. "Oh, and your guests will be cited or towed during the next snow emergency if they park on the street overnight. Just so you know." She walks away, boots crunching through the fresh powder, and I stand there with my notepad getting wetter by the second. I have to leave for my route in 20 minutes, and I am already behind because I spent half an hour this morning breaking up the ice chunks the HOA plow left at the end of my driveway. The plow comes through every storm and shoves heavy compacted snow right across everyone's driveway aprons. Most people just drive over it or chip away at it gradually. But 2 weeks ago, Heather sent me a formal letter saying that ice chunks constituted a pedestrian hazard and I was required to break them up immediately after each plow pass. She did not send that letter to anyone else on the block. Just me. I finish my route that afternoon and swing by the HOA management office on the way home. It is a small building near the community clubhouse, and the manager, a guy named Derek, is usually reasonable. I walk in and ask if I can see a copy of the winter rules, because I want to make sure I understand what counts as a violation. Derek frowns and says he will email me the covenant packet, but when I press him about the tarp rule specifically, he admits he is not sure that rule exists. "Heather has been adding a lot of interpretation lately," he says quietly. "If you want to challenge it, you need to request a hearing with the board." I thank him and leave. I sit in my truck in the parking lot and open the email he just sent. I scroll through the covenant PDF on my phone. There is a section about exterior modifications. It says homeowners must submit requests for changes to siding, paint, or permanent structures. It does not say anything about emergency tarps. It does not say anything about temporary repairs. I screenshot the section and save it to a folder. That night, I call my friend Lisa, who works at the courthouse downtown. She has dealt with HOA disputes before, and she knows the process. I explain what happened, and she tells me to document everything, keep copies of every email and letter, and start taking photos with timestamps. She also tells me that Heather has a reputation. Apparently, she has been on the board for 6 years, and she has driven out 3 different management companies because she insists on running everything herself. Lisa says if she is threatening fees that are not in the covenants, she is making things up. You need to call her bluff, but do it carefully. She will escalate. 2 days later, I get a formal letter in my mailbox. It is from the Lakeshore Freeze Point HOA board, signed by Heather. The letter says my tarp is still in place, and I am now subject to a $200 fine plus $50 in administrative fees. And if the tarp is not removed within 5 days, the fines will increase by $100 per day. At the bottom of the letter, in smaller print, it says I have the right to request a hearing within 10 days. I request the hearing that afternoon. I email Derek and copy Heather. I say I am formally disputing the fine because the tarp is an emergency repair and the covenant does not prohibit temporary measures. I attach the screenshot of the relevant section. I keep the tone polite and factual. I do not mention that Heather is out of her mind. Heather replies within an hour. She does not address my point about the covenant. Instead, she writes that the board will schedule a hearing, but in the meantime, the fines continue to accrue. She also adds a line at the end that makes my stomach drop. She writes, "Please be advised that during the next declared snow emergency, any vehicles parked on the street will be subject to citation and removal, and guests of residents in violation status will not be granted parking exceptions." I read it twice. Violation status. She is inventing categories now. I forward the email to Lisa and ask her what that means. She calls me 10 minutes later and says it means nothing. There is no such thing as violation status in HOA law. Heather is trying to intimidate you. But she also warns me that if Heather has access to a tow company, she might actually try to tow someone. Lisa tells me to keep my truck in my driveway and warn anyone who visits. The hearing is scheduled for 2 weeks out, which means I have to keep that tarp on my roof through another storm cycle. The city has already posted a potential ticket window for uncleared sidewalks, and Heather has been emailing the whole neighborhood, reminding everyone that the city will fine homeowners if their walks are not cleared within 12 hours of the end of a snowfall. She has also been hinting that she will personally report anyone who does not comply. The pressure is real because my shift starts at 6 in the morning, and if I get a city ticket on my record, it could affect my employment. The Postal Service does not mess around with compliance issues. 3 days before the hearing, I come home from my route and find Heather standing in my front yard with 2 other people I do not recognize. She has her phone on the gimbal, filming, and she is pointing at the ice chunks near my mailbox. One of the other people is holding a clipboard. The other one is just standing there with his arms crossed, staring at me. I park my truck and walk over. I ask Heather what she is doing on my property. She says she is conducting a site inspection for the hearing, and I need to cooperate. I ask her if she got my permission to be on my property. She ignores the question and turns to the person with the clipboard. "This is Dan," she says. "He is a contractor I brought in to assess the hazard level of your driveway and walkway." Dan looks uncomfortable, but he nods. Heather continues, "And this is my backup, in case you decide to be difficult." I look at the backup guy. He is wearing a security guard uniform. I recognize him. He works at the clubhouse sometimes, hovering near the door during events. I ask Heather if she seriously brought a security guard to my house to watch me. She smiles and says she is just taking reasonable precautions because I have been uncooperative. I pull out my phone and start filming her. I say, for the recording, that I did not give her permission to enter my property and I am asking her to leave. Heather's smile disappears. She steps closer, her phone still recording, and says, "You do not get to tell me what to do. You do not get an opinion. You get a fine schedule." I stay calm. I repeat that she needs to leave, and I say I am calling the non-emergency police line if she does not. The contractor Dan shifts his weight and looks at Heather. He mumbles something about having another appointment. Heather snaps at him to stay put, but he is already walking toward his truck. The security guard looks like he wants to disappear. Heather realizes she is losing control of her little scene. She lowers her phone and says, "Fine. We will include your refusal to cooperate in the hearing record." Then she turns and walks back toward the street, motioning for the security guard to follow. I watch them leave, and then I go inside and email Lisa the video I just took. She replies immediately. She says that was trespassing, and you have it on camera. Bring it to the hearing. The night before the hearing, I sit at my kitchen table and put together a clean timeline packet. I print out every email, every letter, every screenshot of the covenant. I include the video of Heather trespassing. I include photos of the tarp, the ice chunks, the plow damage. I include weather screenshots showing the exact dates of the storms. I make sure nothing has readable text, just dates and timestamps and my own notes summarizing what happened. I put it all in a tabbed binder so I can reference each section quickly. Lisa comes over to help me practice. She plays the role of Heather and fires hostile questions at me. She tells me to stay calm, stick to facts, and do not get emotional. She also tells me something that makes me pause. She says, if Heather is making up rules and fees, there is a chance she is doing it to cover something else. HOA boards that go rogue usually have money problems. You might want to ask for a copy of the budget and expense reports. I had not thought of that. I add a note to my packet reminding myself to request financials during the hearing. The hearing is held in the clubhouse meeting room at 7 in the evening. The board is sitting at a long table at the front. Heather is in the center. There are 2 other board members, both older, both looking like they would rather be anywhere else. Derek, the management company guy, is sitting off to the side taking notes. There are about a dozen other residents in the audience, mostly people who have had their own issues with Heather and want to see what happens. Heather calls the meeting to order and reads the violation into the record. She says, I have refused to remove an unapproved tarp. I have failed to maintain my driveway in a safe condition, and I have been uncooperative with board inspections. She adds that my actions demonstrate a pattern of disregard for community standards. Then she sits back and folds her arms, looking pleased with herself. I stand up and walk to the front. I hand Derek a copy of my timeline packet and ask him to distribute it to the board. Heather objects immediately, saying I did not submit evidence in advance. Derek looks at her and says quietly that there is no rule requiring advance submission. Heather glares at him, but she takes the packet. I start with the tarp. I open my packet to the covenant section and read it aloud. I point out that the covenant only restricts permanent modifications and that my tarp is a temporary emergency repair. I show photos of the damaged shingles and the dates of the ice storm. I explain that I contacted 3 roofers and none of them can schedule me until March. One of the other board members, an older man named Carl, asks if I plan to leave the tarp up until March. I say yes, unless the board wants to pay for an emergency repair crew, which would cost about $4,000. Carl frowns and looks at Heather. Heather interrupts and says the covenant is clear and I should have planned better. I move on to the driveway. I show photos of the ice chunks the HOA plow left, and I read Heather's letter demanding I break them up immediately. I point out that no other homeowner on my street received this letter. I ask Heather why I am being singled out. She says it is because my driveway is a higher traffic area due to my work schedule. I ask her how she knows my work schedule. She does not answer. Then I play the video of her trespassing. The room goes quiet. On the screen, Heather is clearly on my property, filming, with her contractor and her security guard. You can hear me asking her to leave and her refusing. Carl watches the whole thing and then looks at Heather. He asks her if she got permission to be on my property. Heather says she does not need permission to conduct board business. Carl shakes his head. That is not correct, he says. You need permission. Heather's face flushes. She starts to argue, but I cut her off. I say I am requesting a full financial report from the board, including the expense ledger and all vendor contracts, because I want to understand where these fines are going and who authorized them. Heather freezes. She stares at me for a long moment, and then she says, "That is not relevant to this hearing." I say, "It is absolutely relevant, because if you are imposing fines that are not in the covenant, I want to see the budget line that authorizes them." Derek clears his throat. He says, "Actually, that is a reasonable request. Homeowners are entitled to review financials." Heather looks like she wants to leap across the table. She snaps that the financials are available by appointment, and I should have requested them weeks ago. I say I am requesting them now, and I want them before any fines are finalized. The meeting goes on for another 30 minutes. Heather tries to pivot back to the tarp, but Carl keeps asking questions about the trespassing incident and the driveway letters. The third board member, a quiet woman named Janice, asks why I am the only one getting these letters. Heather says it is because I am the only one violating the rules. I point out that half the neighborhood has tarps or damaged gutters or plow debris, and none of them are getting letters. Finally, Carl motions to table the fine until the next meeting. He says the board needs to review the covenant language and the financials before moving forward. Heather objects loudly, but Carl ignores her. Janice seconds the motion. It passes 2-1, with Heather voting no. I leave the meeting with my packet and my notepad, and Lisa meets me in the parking lot. She was sitting in the back watching the whole thing. She grins and says, "You rattled her. That financials request was perfect. If she is hiding something, she is going to make a mistake now." Lisa is right. 2 days later, I get an email from Derek saying the board has scheduled a budget review meeting for the following week, and I am welcome to attend. He also attaches a PDF of the most recent expense report. I open it on my phone and start scrolling. Most of the line items look normal. Snow removal, landscaping, clubhouse maintenance. But there are several entries labeled winter compliance fees and vendor surcharges that do not have detailed descriptions. I screenshot those and send them to Lisa. She calls me that night. She says, "Those vendor surcharges are weird. They are all going to the same company, and the amounts do not match the contracts. You need to ask about those at the meeting." If you are enjoying this story, hit that like button and subscribe for more wild HOA drama. The budget review meeting is smaller than the hearing. It is just the board, Derek, and about 6 homeowners, including me. Heather is sitting at the table with a thick binder in front of her, and she looks like she has not slept. Carl starts the meeting by reviewing the overall budget, and then he opens the floor for questions. I raise my hand immediately. I ask about the winter compliance fees and the vendor surcharges. I ask which vendor is receiving the payments and what services they are providing. Heather jumps in and says those are administrative costs related to enforcement and inspections. I ask for the vendor name. She hesitates, then says it is a third-party compliance firm. I ask if the board has a contract with this firm. Heather says yes, but she does not have it with her. Carl looks at Derek and asks if he has a copy of the contract. Derek shakes his head. He says he has never seen a contract for that vendor. The room gets very quiet. Carl asks Heather to provide the contract by the end of the week. Heather agrees, but she looks trapped. Janice asks how long the board has been using this vendor. Heather says 2 years. Janice asks why the expense amounts keep increasing. Heather does not have an answer. After the meeting, I walk out with Carl. He stops me in the hallway and says quietly, "I am going to look into this. If those payments are not legitimate, we have a serious problem." I thank him and leave. 3 days later, I get a text from Lisa. She says, "Check your email now." I pull over on my route and open my inbox. There is a message from Carl with the subject line "Urgent Board Matter." The email says the board has discovered discrepancies in the expense ledger, and they are conducting an internal audit. He says the winter compliance fees were paid to a vendor that does not exist, and the payments were approved solely by Heather. He says the board is meeting an emergency session that evening, and I am invited to attend as a witness. I forward the email to Lisa and call her. She says that is fraud. If she has been funneling HOA money to a fake vendor, that is embezzlement. You need to go to that meeting, and you need to bring everything you have. The emergency meeting is tense. The room is packed. Word has spread fast, and half the neighborhood is there. Heather is sitting at the table alone. Carl and Janice are at the opposite end, and Derek is next to them. Carl starts by reading a summary of the audit findings. He says the board has identified over $30,000 in payments to a vendor called Winter Compliance Solutions. But the vendor does not have a business license, no address on file, and no one at the management company has ever spoken to them. He says all the payments were authorized by Heather using an emergency spending provision that is supposed to be for urgent repairs, not compliance. Heather tries to interrupt, but Carl holds up his hand. He says, "I am not done." He continues. The audit also found that Heather has been issuing fines that are not in the covenant and collecting payments directly, rather than routing them through the management company. He says several homeowners have paid fines for violations that do not exist, and the money has not been deposited into the HOA account. The room erupts. People are shouting questions. Someone asks where the money went. Someone else asks if Heather is going to jail. Heather stands up, her face pale, and says this is all a misunderstanding. She says the vendor was hired to handle enforcement because the management company was not doing their job. Carl asks her to provide proof. She says the paperwork is at her house. Carl says the board requested the paperwork a week ago, and she has not provided it. Janice speaks up. She says, Heather, if you do not have the paperwork, then the payments are not legitimate. We need to involve the authorities. Heather looks around the room, her phone still mounted on the gimbal even though she is not filming. She says, you do not get to do this. You do not get an opinion. You get a fine schedule. Carl stares at her. That does not make sense, he says. Heather realizes what she just said. She sits down and covers her face with her hands. I stand up. I pull out my timeline packet and walk to the front. I say I have been documenting Heather's enforcement actions for the past 3 weeks, and I have evidence that she has been targeting homeowners with fake violations. I hand Carl my binder. I say, I let the meeting move on, because my move was not a speech, it was a document. Carl opens the binder and starts flipping through it. He stops at the section with the emails and the trespassing video. He looks up at Heather and says, this is bad. This is really bad. Janice leans over to look at the binder, and her eyes go wide. Derek speaks up. He says he contacted the City Code Enforcement Office earlier that day to verify whether the HOA has any authority over snow removal beyond what is in the covenant. He says the city confirmed that the HOA cannot issue fines for temporary roof repairs, and they cannot restrict guest parking during snow emergencies unless the parking is blocking a fire lane. He pulls out a printed letter from the city and hands it to Carl. He says, this is a city code enforcement confirmation that the HOA has no authority over the issue. Carl reads the letter out loud. Then he looks at Heather and says, you have been issuing fines for violations that do not exist, and you have been collecting money that should have gone to the HOA. This is fraud. Heather does not respond. She just sits there, staring at the table. Carl calls for a vote. He says the board needs to immediately suspend Heather's enforcement authority, remove her from the architectural committee, and refer the matter to the police. Janice seconds. The vote is unanimous, with Heather abstaining. Carl tells Heather she is no longer authorized to conduct inspections, issue fines, or represent the board in any capacity. He also tells her that the board will be filing a formal complaint with the police and the state attorney general. The meeting ends, and people start filing out. Heather sits at the table for a long time, not moving. Eventually, Derek walks over and says something to her quietly. She picks up her binder and leaves without looking at anyone. I walk out with Lisa. She is grinning. She says, you did it. You caught her. I say, I just asked for the receipts. She did the rest. 2 days later, I get a call from a detective with the Anchorage Police Department. He says they are investigating financial irregularities at the Lakeshore Freeze Point HOA, and they would like to interview me as a witness. I agree and we schedule a meeting for the following week. The detective also tells me that Heather has been placed on a no-contact directive by the management company, which means she is not allowed to email, call, or approach any homeowner outside of official board meetings. He says, if she violates the directive, I should call the police immediately. The next board meeting is 2 weeks later. Heather does not attend. Carl announces that the board has completed the audit, and they have identified over $40,000 in fraudulent payments and unreturned fines. He says the board is working with an attorney to recover the funds, and they have filed a civil suit against Heather. He also announces that the board is retracting all winter violation notices issued by Heather in the past 2 years, and any fines that were paid will be refunded. The room applauds. Carl continues. He says the board is also revising the covenant enforcement procedures to prevent this from happening again. He says all fines must be approved by a majority vote of the board, and all vendor contracts must be reviewed by the management company before payment. He says the board is committed to transparency and accountability going forward. After the meeting, I stop by Derek's office to pick up my refund check. He hands me an envelope and says, I am sorry this happened. We should have caught it sooner. I tell him it is not his fault. Heather was good at hiding it. He nods and says she was also good at making people afraid to ask questions. You are not afraid. I leave the office and drive home. The tarp is still on my roof, but now I do not have to worry about fines. I scheduled a roofer for March, and the board sent me a letter formally acknowledging that temporary repairs are allowed under the covenant. A week later, I am finishing my route when I see Heather's car in the neighborhood. She is parked at the end of my street, near the plow berm that always forms at the corner. I slow down as I approach, and I see her standing next to a traffic cone she has dragged into the middle of the road. She is wearing her blue puffer coat and her black knit hat, and she has her phone on the gimbal. She is filming the street. I pull over and get out. I walk toward her and ask what she is doing. She turns and glares at me. She says, "Your snow pile forced me to do this. Your driveway is a hazard, and I am documenting it for the city." I look at the cone. It is sitting in the middle of the road, blocking traffic. I look at my driveway. The snow pile is where the plow left it, same as everyone else's. I pull out my phone and start filming. I say, "You are blocking the road with a cone. That is illegal." Heather steps closer and says, "You do not get an opinion, you get a fine schedule." I say, "You are not on the board anymore. You do not get to issue fines." She opens her mouth to respond, but then a truck pulls up behind us. It is a tow truck, idling loudly. The driver gets out. He is a big guy in a heavy coat, and he looks annoyed. He walks over and asks Heather what she is doing. She says she called him to remove a vehicle that is parked illegally. He asks which vehicle. She points at my postal truck. The driver looks at my truck, then looks at me. He asks if I am parked legally. I say yes, I am on my route, and I am parked in a designated spot. The driver looks at Heather. He says, "I am not towing a postal vehicle. That is federal property." Heather's face turns red. She says, "You have to. I am authorized by the HOA." The driver shakes his head. He says, "Lady, I do not care what the HOA says. I am not touching that truck." Then he looks at me and says, "You got proof this is legal?" I pull out my timeline packet from my truck. I have been carrying it with me everywhere. I flip to the section with the city code enforcement letter and the board meeting minutes. I show the driver the proof that Heather has no authority to issue towing orders. He reads it, nods, and hands it back to me. He looks at Heather and says, "You need to stop calling me. This is the third time this month, and every time it is bogus." He gets back in his truck and drives away. Heather stares at me. Her hands are shaking. She says, "You think you won. You think this is over." I do not say anything. I just stand there holding my binder. She picks up the cone and throws it into the snow. Then she gets in her car and drives away. That night, I get a call from Carl. He says the police have charged Heather with embezzlement and fraud. He says the investigation found that she created the fake vendor and deposited the payments into a personal account. He also says the board has voted to formally censure her, strip her committee powers, and ban her from contacting homeowners outside of official meetings. He says the board is also seeking a restraining order based on her behavior toward multiple residents, including me. Carl says, "I want to thank you. If you had not pushed for the financials, we never would have found this." I tell him I just wanted to understand where the fines were going. He laughs and says, "Well, now we know." He also tells me that the board is planning to hold a special election to fill Heather's seat, and he hopes I will consider running. I tell him I will think about it. 2 months later, the criminal case is moving forward. Heather has been ordered to repay the HOA, and she is facing up to 5 years in prison. The board has refunded every bogus fine, including mine. The neighborhood is quieter now. The new architectural committee chair is a retired teacher named Paula, and she actually follows the covenant instead of making things up. I finally got my roof fixed in March. The roofer did a great job, and the tarp is gone. I kept it though. It is folded up in my garage, just in case I ever need a reminder of how this whole thing started. One afternoon in early April, I am walking to my truck after my route when I see Paula outside the clubhouse. She waves me over and says the board wants to formally apologize for what happened. She hands me a letter on HOA stationery. It is signed by Carl, Janice, and the new board members. It says the board recognizes that I was unfairly targeted, and they are committed to making sure it never happens again. It also says the board has updated the enforcement policy, and all violations will now be reviewed by the full board before fines are issued. Paula also tells me that the budget review revealed vendor favoritism across multiple contracts, not just the fake compliance vendor. She says the board is rebidding all the service contracts and implementing new oversight procedures. She says, "You asking for those financials opened up a whole can of worms, and honestly, we needed it. The HOA was out of control." I thank her and drive home. The street is clear now, no ice chunks, no plow berms, no cones in the road. The neighborhood feels different. People are friendlier. A few of them have stopped me on my route to say thank you for standing up to Heather. One guy even baked me cookies. The following week, I get a letter from the police department. It is an update on the case. The letter says Heather has pled guilty to embezzlement and fraud, and she has been sentenced to 3 years in prison and ordered to pay full restitution to the HOA. The letter also says the no-contact directive is now a formal restraining order, and if she violates it, she will face additional charges. I file the letter in my binder. I have been keeping everything, just in case. Lisa tells me I should write a book about this. I tell her maybe someday, but for now I am just glad it is over. A month later, the HOA holds the special election. Paula wins in a landslide. Carl is re-elected as president. Janice stays on as treasurer. The new board is functional, transparent, and boring, which is exactly what an HOA should be. They send out a newsletter every month with clear updates on finances, maintenance, and upcoming projects. There are no mystery fees, no fake vendors, no screaming matches in driveways. I still carry my notepad on my route. The pages are not wet anymore, but I keep it handy just in case. Old habits die hard. Every time I see a frozen clipboard clip, I think about that morning when Heather showed up in my driveway yelling about a tarp. I think about how she said I do not get an opinion. I get a fine schedule. I think about how she tried to weaponize the HOA to cover up her own theft. And I think about how a budget review proved her favorite fee was imaginary in the ledger. The neighborhood has moved on. Heather is gone. The board is stable. The rules make sense again. People shovel their walks, the plow does its job, and nobody is getting towed for fake violations. It is boring. It is perfect. One Saturday in May, I am working in my yard when Carl stops by. He is carrying a small box. He says the board wanted to give me something as a thank you. I open the box, and inside is a plaque. It says, "In recognition of your courage and dedication to accountability. Presented by the Lakeshore Freeze Point HOA board." I laugh and tell Carl he did not have to do this. He says, "Yes, we did. You saved this neighborhood." I thank him and we shake hands. That night, I hang the plaque in my garage, right next to the folded tarp. It is a reminder that sometimes the system works, if you push hard enough. It is also a reminder that HOAs are only as good as the people running them, and when those people go rogue, it takes documentation, patience, and a willingness to ask uncomfortable questions to bring them down. Heather thought she could bully me into compliance. She thought she could invent rules and collect money, and nobody would notice. She thought she could use her position to cover up her crimes. She was wrong. And now she is paying for it, both literally and legally. The HOA retracted the winter violation in writing. Karen got placed on a no-contact directive by management. The board conducted a budget review that revealed vendor favoritism, and it all unraveled from there. Her favorite fee got proven imaginary in the ledger, and that single thread pulled apart everything she built. I still see the security guard sometimes when I pass the clubhouse. He waves. I wave back. We do not talk about it. I think he is just glad he does not have to follow Heather around anymore. The Postal Service never found out about the city ticket threat. I kept my record clean. My shift starts at 6, same as always, and I finish my route without drama. No tow trucks. No violations. No screaming matches. Just mail, coffee, and the quiet satisfaction of knowing I stood my ground when it mattered. If you ever find yourself in an HOA nightmare, document everything. Ask for the financials. Do not back down when someone tries to intimidate you. And remember that the people making the rules are just people. They are not infallible. They are not untouchable. And if they are breaking the law, the system will catch them, as long as you give it the evidence it needs. Thanks for watching, and I will catch you in the next one.